The first human ship to cross the lattice did not arrive with a roar or a blaze of weapons, but with a hesitation that spread across the observatories of three-star systems like a held breath. It slipped into existence at the edge of the Pellar expanse, where folded spacetime usually shivered for a few heartbeats before smoothing itself out, and it did so imperfectly, trailing ripples that took minutes to settle. The watching instruments, tuned to patterns older than most civilizations, recorded the anomaly and passed the data along their networks. Analysts blinked translucent eyelids, extended tendrils of thought, and felt a ripple of unease. The object was crude in some ways, elegant in others, and wholly unfamiliar. Its hull bore scars not disguised by ceremonial plating, and its power output was irregular, spiking and dipping as if guided by stubborn insistence rather than refined theory. To the watchers, this was not a warship or a trader by any known definition. It was something that had endured. Inside that vessel, a woman named Arkath Moran sat strapped into a command chair that had been rebuilt 3 times since launch. The material beneath her palms was warm with the recycled heat of overworked systems, and the smell of metal and old polymer clung to the air. She did not think of herself as the representative of a species or a banner of pride. She thought of herself as tired, focused, and unwilling to fail again. The lattice crossing had pushed the engines beyond their original tolerances, and the engineers had warned her that another attempt without significant downtime might scatter the ship across half a system. Arkath had accepted the risk anyway, because turning back was no longer an option. Humanity had followed dead ends before, but this time the end of the road had been literal. The ship's name, carved into a reinforced bulkhead near the forward corridor, was Tenacity of Clay. It had been a joke when the keel was laid, a reference to old myths about beings shaped from Earth who refused to break. Over the years, as refits layered upon refits, and the hull accumulated the marks of micrometeor impacts and radiation storms, the name had become less humorous and more accurate. Tenacity of Clay was not beautiful by the standards of any species that prized symmetry or gleaming surfaces, but it held together under stresses that should have torn it apart. Arkath trusted it in a way she had not trusted many people. The crew, a mix of veterans and younger specialists hardened quickly by circumstance, waited for her word. They had rehearsed this moment for months during the long transit between stars, but rehearsals were pale things compared to reality. The sensors were already lighting up with responses from the surrounding space, faint pulses that hinted at an organized presence. Humanity had known it was unlikely they would find an empty galaxy beyond the lattice. What they had not known was how they would be received, or whether reception was even possible in any meaningful sense. "Hold position," Arkath said, her voice steady despite the tension pressing against her chest. "Route all non-essential power to shields and environmental stability. I want us calm and obvious, not twitchy." The crew obeyed, hands moving across interfaces that bore more wear than polish. The ship's systems hummed into a new equilibrium, and the oscillations from the lattice crossing dampened further. Outside, the Pellar expanse revealed itself in full, a sweep of stars and faint nebula wisps threaded by structures that could not be natural. Great arcs of material glowed softly, forming pathways between points of gravity, and vast silhouettes loomed in the distance, their scale defying easy measurement. This was not a frontier in the human sense. This was a crossroads long in use. The first contact signal did not come in a form that any human linguist would have chosen, but it came nonetheless. A cascade of electromagnetic pulses, layered with neutrino modulations and gravitational microvariations, washed over Tenacity of Clay. The ship's translators, cobbled together from human theory and desperate extrapolation, struggled to find patterns. Arkath felt the familiar knot of fear tighten. They had prepared for this, had spent years designing systems to recognize intent rather than words, but preparation was not certainty. Parsing intent vectors, reported Selm Icaro from the analysis station, his eyes unfocused as he monitored data streams projected directly into his visual cortex. High complexity, no immediate hostile markers. There is curiosity, caution, a request for identification, I think, not just who we are, but what kind of beings we are. Arkath exhaled slowly. That at least was something they could answer honestly. Transmit baseline information. Biology, origin star, method of arrival, no military specs. Emphasize that we came through the lattice with difficulty and that we are seeking dialogue, not territory. The response took longer this time, stretching into minutes that felt like hours. In that span, Arkath's thoughts drifted back to the long path that had brought them here. Humanity had not set out to be defiant or exceptional. It had set out to survive. The early centuries among the stars had been marked by fragmentation, by colonies lost to miscalculation or internal strife, by technologies that promised salvation and delivered new problems. When the lattice was first discovered, an ancient structure buried in the gravity well of a rogue planet, it had been seen as another gamble. The lattice did not obey known physics, and attempts to probe it remotely had resulted in data corruption and the loss of instruments. It had taken a coalition of desperate habitats facing resource collapse to authorize a manned expedition. Tenacity of Clay had been that expedition's last iteration, a ship built from lessons paid for in blood and vacuum. The reply that finally came was clearer, as if the senders had adjusted their approach based on the human transmission. The pulses resolved into a construct that the translators could map onto human language with only minor distortion. Travelers of constrained form, it began, the words resonating with a tone that suggested both formality and interest. You stand within a nexus maintained by many. Your passage was observed with concern. Your vessel bears marks of repeated failure and continuation. State your purpose with precision. Arkath considered her answer carefully. She was acutely aware that every word might shape humanity's future among these stars. We are a people from a distant region of space, she said at last. Our environment became untenable. We found a way here through effort and loss. We seek knowledge, cooperation, and a place to exist without causing harm. We understand that this region is not empty and that we must earn any trust extended to us. There was another pause, shorter this time. Then, unexpectedly, the response carried something akin to amusement. Many who arrive speak of conquest or destiny. Few speak of earning. Your words are noted. Know that the assemblies will observe you. You will be tested, not by declaration, but by response. For now, remain. You will be approached. The channel closed, leaving the bridge filled with the quiet murmur of systems and the soft breaths of the crew. Arkath felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief that they had not been immediately destroyed, dread at the mention of tests, and a fierce spark of resolve. Humanity had been tested by empty space, by hostile worlds, by its own failings. Tests were not new. What was new was the audience. The approach came in the form of a vessel that seemed to unfold from the fabric of space itself. It was not a single hull, but a cluster of forms bound by shimmering fields, each segment moving with subtle independence. Its propulsion left no visible trace, and its energy signature was balanced in a way that suggested a mastery of forces humans barely understood. As it drew closer, Arkath could not help but compare it to tenacity of clay. Where the human ship was scarred and asymmetrical, this one was pristine, its surfaces reflecting starlight in patterns that shifted like thought. Maintain posture, Arkath ordered. Open all non-threatening channels. Let them see us as we are. A new signal resolved, this time carrying a visual component. The bridge's main display filled with an image that made several crew members gasp. The being projected was tall by human standards, its body composed of layered tissues that refracted light, giving it an almost crystalline appearance. Multiple eyes, arranged in a gentle curve along its upper torso, focused forward, while lower appendages rested in a configuration that suggested stability rather than aggression. It was beautiful in an alien way, and utterly unlike anything humanity had encountered. "I am Catherine of the Bound Weave," the being said, its voice translated into a calm, resonant tone. "I am tasked with initial engagement. You have crossed barriers that deter many. Explain how a species with such limited theoretical framework accomplished this." Arkath met the gaze of the many eyes without flinching. "We did not accomplish it cleanly," she replied. "We learned by breaking things and by refusing to stop when they broke. Our theories lagged behind our needs. We built systems that could be repaired in the field and crews trained to adapt under pressure. We accepted losses and recorded them so others would not repeat them." Catherine tilted its upper body slightly, a gesture that the translators flagged as increased attention. "You speak of persistence as a primary strategy." "Yes," Arkath said, "we have found that persistence, coupled with reflection, can compensate for a great deal of ignorance." The being considered this. "Among the assemblies, there is debate about the value of such an approach. Many civilizations refine their understanding before acting, those that do not often destroy themselves. We came close," Arkath admitted, "more than once. The difference, I think, is that we did not confuse failure with finality." Catherine's eyes brightened fractionally. "This distinction is of interest. Your test will be simple in description and complex in execution. There is a region within the nexus where structural decay threatens shared pathways. Many have attempted stabilization and failed due to cascading effects. You will be granted access. Your task is not necessarily to succeed, but to engage without causing further harm. Your methods will be observed." The implications rippled through the bridge. This was not a symbolic trial. It was a real problem with real stakes. Arkath felt the weight settle onto her shoulders, familiar and unwelcome. "We accept," she said, because there was no other answer that aligned with who they were. "Then prepare," Catherine replied. "Know that assistance will be limited. The purpose is not to save the region at any cost, but to understand you." As the projection faded, Arkath turned to her crew. She saw fear there, and excitement, and a grim readiness. "You heard them," she said. "We are not here to impress with perfection. We are here to do what we have always done. Assess, adapt, endure. We will make mistakes. We will fix them. We will leave things better than we found them, or we will leave knowing we tried without arrogance." Selm nodded slowly. "They expect us to fail elegantly," he said. "We are better at failing messily and learning." A few chuckles broke the tension, and Arkath allowed herself a brief smile. "Then let us give them a lesson in our particular mess." As tenacity of clay adjusted course toward the designated region, Arkath reflected on the irony of it all. Humanity had been shaped by environments that did not care whether it lived or died. Now, in a nexus maintained by beings of immense capability, that same stubborn refusal to yield was their most valuable trait. Whatever awaited them in the decaying pathways ahead, it would not be met with despair or grand speeches. It would be met with tools, with sweat, with arguments and compromises, and long hours spent coaxing broken systems back into functionality. The Pellar Expanse watched as the human ship moved, small and scarred against the vastness, and something shifted in the calculus of the assemblies. It was not hope in the human sense, nor fear, but a recognition that this new variable did not fit neatly into existing models. For the first time in a long while, the nexus would be shaped not by those who sought balance through perfection, but by those who had learned to live with imperfection and move forward anyway. The region designated for intervention lay along one of the nexus pathways that threaded between stars like a living thing, flexing and adapting over epochs. As tenacity of clay approached, the human senses struggled to interpret what they were seeing. The pathway was not a structure in the conventional sense, but a maintained distortion, a corridor where space folded gently to allow efficient transit. Now that distortion shuddered unevenly, its edges fraying into turbulent eddies that threatened to unravel the route entirely. The surrounding void glittered with particulate energy and debris from past stabilization attempts, each fragment a testament to failure by civilizations that had wielded tools far more advanced than humanity's. Arkath studied the data with a frown, her mind already shifting into the mode that years of crisis had honed. "This is not a broken beam or a cracked hull," she said. "It is more like a weather system inside spacetime. We cannot patch it, we have to influence it." Selm nodded, fingers dancing as he overlaid human models onto the alien readings. Their previous attempts appear to have focused on reinforcing the distortion directly, adding energy to counter the decay. That seems to have made the cascades worse. The pathway reacts badly to rigidity. "Like a joint that needs movement rather than splinting," Arkath said. "All right, what can we do that is flexible?" The answer was not immediately obvious, and that was where humanity's particular approach began to diverge from the expectations of the Watchers. Rather than seeking a grand solution, the crew broke the problem down into dozens of smaller, more manageable questions. How did the distortion respond to minor fluctuations? Were there harmonics within the decay that could be dampened? Could they introduce controlled instability to bleed off the dangerous buildup? Teams formed and reformed as hypotheses were proposed, tested, and discarded. The bridge buzzed with argument, not the theatrical kind, but the practical, sometimes irritable exchanges of people who cared more about results than ego. Kethrin observed from a distance, its vessel maintaining a steady position just outside the most volatile region. Through channels that humans could not access, it relayed impressions to the bound weave and beyond. "They do not attempt to impose order," Kethrin reported. "They probe, they withdraw, they argue among themselves openly. There is inefficiency, but also rapid adaptation." Within tenacity of clay, the first test maneuver began. A small drone, built originally for hull inspection and long since modified beyond its initial purpose, was guided toward the fraying edge of the pathway. Its sensors streamed data back as it dipped into the turbulent zone, its field generators straining to maintain cohesion. Almost immediately, the readings spiked, and the drone's outer shell began to shear. "Pull it back," Arkath ordered without hesitation. The drone was retrieved in pieces, its core barely intact. The crew winced collectively, but there was no despair. The data it carried was more valuable than the hardware. Selm analyzed the readings, his brow furrowing. "The decay responds sharply to abrupt energy gradients," he said. "The drone's fields were too uniform. It was like dropping a rigid object into a whirlpool." "So we need to go with the flow," Arkath said. "Can we modulate our fields to be uneven, responsive?" An engineer named Veshan, whose early career had been spent keeping aging reactors stable on marginal colonies, leaned forward. "We could jury-rig a variable field emitter. It would constantly adjust output based on local feedback, not a preset pattern. It will be ugly and inefficient, but it might avoid triggering the worst reactions." "Ugly and inefficient we can do," Arkath said. "Make it small enough to sacrifice if needed." Hours passed as the crew worked, repurposing components and arguing over configurations. The resulting device bore little resemblance to anything in a design manual. It was a tangle of emitters and processors housed in a reinforced shell, its software a patchwork of heuristics rather than elegant equations. When it was finally deployed, it drifted toward the decay zone like a hesitant swimmer entering rough water. This time, the readings were different. The pathway shuddered, but the device adjusted, its fields warping in response to local fluctuations. Instead of tearing apart, it rode the turbulence, shedding excess energy in small, controlled bursts. The decay did not reverse, but it slowed, its most violent oscillations dampened. A murmur ran through the bridge. "We are not fixing it," Selm said slowly. "We are buying time." "Sometimes that is the fix," Arkath replied. "Stabilize enough to let the system heal itself, or at least stop getting worse." "Can we scale this?" Scaling was where the real challenge lay. One improvised device was manageable. Dozens, interacting with one another, and the pathway introduced complexity that threatened to spiral out of control. The crew debated whether to deploy a swarm or to attempt a larger, more capable unit. Each option carried risks. A swarm could adapt locally, but might produce emergent behaviors they could not predict. A single larger unit would be easier to monitor, but more catastrophic if it failed. While the humans deliberated, Catherine requested a direct communication. The being's image appeared on the bridge once more, eyes reflecting the chaotic beauty of the decaying pathway behind it. Your approach diverges from prior attempts, it said. You accept partial mitigation rather than total resolution. This is noted. Be aware that time is a factor. If the pathway collapses beyond a threshold, intervention will be impossible without significant harm. Arkath met its gaze. We understand, but forcing a total resolution too quickly seems to be what caused the previous failures. We are trying to listen to the system rather than shout at it. Catherine considered this. Listening is not a common strategy at this scale. Neither is surviving on planets that actively try to kill you, Arkath said mildly. A flicker passed through Catherine's eyes that the translators flagged as increased interest. Proceed. We will continue to observe. The decision was made to deploy a limited swarm, each unit equipped with the adaptive field emitters, but tuned slightly differently. The idea was not to enforce uniformity, but to introduce a kind of controlled diversity, allowing the swarm to cover a range of responses and collectively dampen the decay. It was a gamble, and everyone on the bridge knew it. As the first units entered the pathway, the space around them lit with shifting colors as energies interacted in complex ways. The decay responded, flaring in some areas and calming in others. Several units failed quickly, torn apart by unexpected surges. Others persisted, their fields warping and flexing as designed. The swarm's overall effect was uneven, but measurable. The most dangerous oscillations decreased in frequency, and the pathway's structure began to resemble something closer to stability. Telemetry is all over the place, Selm said, a hint of awe in his voice. But the trend is positive. We are reducing peak stress. Good, Arkath said. Keep adjusting. If a unit fails, learn why and adapt the others. The process was exhausting. Crew members rotated through stations, some grabbing moments of rest while others pushed on. Arguments flared and cooled. At one point, a feedback loop nearly destabilized the swarm, and it was only quick manual intervention that prevented a cascade. Arkath found herself making decisions with incomplete information, relying on instinct honed by years of making do with less than ideal conditions. Throughout it all, the Watchers observed, not just Catherine, but representatives of other assemblies, their perceptions tuned to different aspects of the intervention. Some focused on the physics, others on the social dynamics, aboard tenacity of clay. They noted the lack of rigid hierarchy in moments of crisis, the way expertise trumped rank when seconds mattered. They noted the willingness to sacrifice equipment without hesitation and the careful accounting of those losses afterward. They noted, above all, the refusal to abandon the effort even when success was uncertain. After what felt like an eternity, the swarm reached a tenuous equilibrium. The pathway still bore scars, and the decay had not been eliminated, but it had been transformed from a runaway process into a manageable one. Automated maintenance systems, long overwhelmed, began to reassert themselves, their subtle corrections now able to keep pace with the damage. The crisis, while not resolved forever, had been averted. A collective exhale swept through the bridge. Some crew members slumped in their seats, others laughed softly, the sound edged with exhaustion. Arkath allowed herself a moment to feel the relief before straightening. Begin retrieval of surviving units, she said. Catalog everything. We will need to explain this clearly. Catherine's communication came almost immediately. The pathway persists, the being said. The harm threshold has not been crossed. This outcome was not predicted. Arkath nodded. It was not guaranteed. There is debate among the assemblies, Catherine continued. Some argue that your intervention was reckless, that the partial failures endangered shared infrastructure. Others note that all prior approaches sought certainty and achieved collapse. Your method embraced uncertainty and achieved continuity. That is a fair summary, Arkath said. We did endanger things, we did not pretend otherwise, but we also paid attention when the system pushed back. Kethrin was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its tone carried something new. You have demonstrated a form of problem engagement that is rare at this scale. It is not efficient. It is not elegant, it is resilient. The assemblies will not reach consensus quickly, but your presence here will not be dismissed. That, Arkath knew, was as much as they could hope for at this stage. We are not asking for dismissal or favor, she said, only the chance to continue existing and contributing without being seen as a threat by default. Kethrin inclined its upper body. Existence is always a negotiation. You have entered it with scars visible and intent declared. This is acceptable. As the communication ended, Arkath looked around the bridge at her crew. They were battered, tired, and grinning like people who had just held a collapsing wall long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Good work, she said simply. Get some rest. We are not done, but we have taken the first step. Later, as tenacity of clay drifted in a holding pattern near the now stable pathway, Arkath stood alone near the forward viewport. The Pellar expanse stretched before her, vast and indifferent, yet now threaded with possibility. Humanity had not impressed the assemblies with power or perfection. It had shown them something else, a way of engaging with a complex, uncaring universe that did not rely on mastery, but on persistence, adaptability, and a willingness to learn from failure without being defined by it. She knew the tests would continue and that not all would end as favorably. There would be misunderstandings, conflicts, perhaps even open hostility from those who saw humanity's approach as dangerous. But as she watched the adaptive units flicker and fade from view, having done their work and been retrieved or lost, Arkath felt a quiet confidence. Whatever came next, humanity would meet it the way it always had, not as conquerors or chosen beings, but as people who refused to stop trying, even when the universe offered no guarantees. The period that followed the stabilization of the pathway was not one of celebration, but of waiting, and waiting proved to be its own kind of strain. Tenacity of clay remained within the nexus, granted provisional anchorage near a cluster of maintenance constructs whose purposes were only partially understood. The assemblies did not rush to judgment. Instead, they observed, deliberated, and in some cases, argued across channels that spanned light years and modes of perception humans could barely conceptualize. For Arkath and her crew, the absence of immediate crisis felt unnatural, like standing on unstable ground that had not yet decided whether it would hold. Supplies were inventoried and rationed with care. The intervention had consumed more raw material and energy than planned, and while the ship was designed for endurance, nothing about their situation allowed for complacency. Engineers dismantled damaged drones and components, salvaging what they could, while analysts replayed telemetry again and again, searching for insights that might prove valuable later. Humanity's approach to survival had always been rooted in preparation born from experience, and experience now told them that attention from powerful neighbors rarely came without strings. It did not take long for those strings to begin to appear. The next contact did not come from Kethrin, but from a collective that identified itself through layered translation as the Orun Deliberative, a grouping whose primary concern was long-term structural stability across the nexus. Their communication was precise, dense with conditional statements and probabilistic assessments. Where Kethrin had spoken with something approaching personality, the Orun Deliberative spoke like an equation-given voice. You have demonstrated an anomalous capacity to operate within high-uncertainty environments, the message began. This capacity correlates with elevated risk tolerance and non-standard decision hierarchies. Such traits are both valuable and hazardous. We propose an evaluation under controlled conditions. Arkath read the message twice before responding. Define controlled, she said, and define evaluation. There exists a region where conflicting maintenance doctrines have produced instability, the deliberative replied. Multiple civilizations have vested interests there. Intervention has been stalled due to deadlock. You will be introduced as an external agent with limited authority. Your task is to facilitate resolution, technical or otherwise, without escalation beyond predefined thresholds. In other words, Arkath thought, they want us to walk into someone else's mess and see what breaks. She felt a flicker of irritation, quickly tempered by pragmatism. This was the price of attention. We will need full disclosure of the interests involved and the thresholds you refer to, she said. We do not operate well when key information is withheld. There was a pause longer than most machine collectives would allow, suggesting internal debate. Complete disclosure is not possible, the deliberative said at last. Partial disclosure will be provided. This limitation is itself part of the evaluation. Arkath grimaced. Humanity's history was littered with disasters born from partial information. Still, refusing outright would likely mark them as uncooperative. We will consider the proposal, she said. But understand this. If we are placed in a situation where the only options are to cause harm or withdraw, we will withdraw. That is not failure by our standards. Noted, the deliberative replied. Your response parameters will be monitored. When the channel closed, Arkath convened a meeting in the ship's communal work area, a space that had once been a cargo bay and now bore the marks of countless retrofits. Crew members gathered on benches and improvised seating, some still bearing grease stains, others with data lenses glowing faintly in their eyes. There was no ceremony. Arkath simply laid out the situation as she understood it. They want to see how we handle conflict that is not purely technical, she said. They will give us enough information to act, but not enough to be comfortable. This is a test of judgment as much as skill. And if we refuse, asked Veshan, then we tell them that we are not the tool they want, Arkath said. That may cost us goodwill, or it may establish boundaries. Hard to say. A younger crew member named Halran, whose first off-world assignment had been this mission, spoke up hesitantly. If we go, are we expected to take sides? Probably, Arkath said honestly, but we do not have to take them the way others expect. The discussion that followed was heated but thoughtful. Some argued that stepping into a multi-party dispute without full context was reckless. Others pointed out that humanity had rarely enjoyed full context and had learned to navigate anyway. What ultimately tipped the balance was not ambition or fear, but a shared recognition that avoiding the situation would not make humanity safer in the long run. If they were to exist within the nexus, they would need to engage with its complexities, not just its machinery. The decision was made to accept, with conditions clearly stated. Humanity would participate as facilitators and problem solvers, not enforcers. They would document their process and share it openly. They would withdraw if forced into actions that violated their core principles, vague though those principles sometimes were. The region in question lay along a convergence of three pathways, each maintained by different collectives with overlapping but not identical priorities. One prioritized efficiency of transit above all else. Another prioritized minimal energetic disturbance to surrounding space. The third prioritized redundancy and resilience, even at the cost of performance. Each had implemented modifications over centuries, layering solutions atop one another until the convergence became a tangled knot of competing influences. The instability had not yet reached crisis levels, but projections showed an increasing likelihood of catastrophic failure if left unaddressed. Tenacity of Clay arrived under escort, its battered hull an odd sight amid the sleek constructs of the region. The local stakeholders did not greet the humans warmly. Initial communications were stiff, formal, and laced with skepticism. One representative, a being whose form resembled a shifting lattice of light and shadow, was particularly blunt. "Your species lacks standing," it said. Why should we defer to your judgment? Arkath resisted the urge to bristle. You should not defer, she replied. We are not here to command. We are here because none of you can move without the others pushing back, and the system is suffering for it. We are an outside perspective with no stake beyond preventing collapse. Another representative, this one a dense, slowly rotating mass that communicated through pressure waves translated into sound, responded. Outside perspectives often lack appreciation for long-term consequences. Inside perspectives often become trapped by precedent, Arkath said. We are offering to help you see options you may be discounting, not to decide for you. The early meetings were frustrating. Each stakeholder presented data supporting its position, often ignoring or downplaying contradictions. Humanities analysts worked tirelessly to integrate these perspectives, mapping not just the technical parameters, but the values underlying them. It became clear that the conflict was not purely about physics. It was about trust, about fear of losing influence, about differing definitions of acceptable risk. Arkath drew on experiences far removed from interstellar infrastructure. She thought of resource disputes on marginal colonies, of water rights and power grids, of communities that had learned the hard way that zero-sum thinking led only to shared ruin. In one particularly tense session, she set aside the projections and addressed the representatives directly. You are all optimizing for your own metrics, she said. None of those metrics are wrong in isolation. The problem is that the convergence does not care which of you is right. It responds to the total pattern of influence. Right now, that pattern is chaotic. The lattice being pulsed with irritation. You speak as if we are ignorant of system dynamics. I speak as if knowing something does not always mean acting on it, Arkath said. We have that problem too. The breakthrough did not come from a grand argument, but from a small, almost accidental demonstration. During a technical review, Selm adjusted a simulation to show what would happen if each stakeholder reduced its influence slightly, not to the point of compromising its core values, but enough to allow the others room to adjust. The result was not optimal by any single metric, but it was stable across all of them. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This represents a loss of efficiency, one representative said slowly, and a gain in resilience, another countered. Arkath seized the moment. We are not proposing permanent sacrifice, she said. We are proposing an experiment, a reversible adjustment. If it fails, you can revert, but if it succeeds, you gain time to refine a better integrated approach. Time, she knew, was a persuasive currency. After prolonged debate, agreement was reached to conduct a limited trial. Humanity would assist in coordinating the adjustments, monitoring interactions, and responding to unexpected effects. The process was delicate. Minor changes rippled through the convergence, producing fluctuations that required constant attention. At several points, it seemed the system might tip into instability anyway, and emergency measures were prepared. But each time, the combined response, informed by multiple perspectives and moderated by human facilitation, brought things back from the edge. The trial held. It was not perfect. Transit efficiency dropped marginally. Energy emissions increased slightly in some bands. But overall stability improved, and the risk of catastrophic failure decreased significantly. More importantly, the stakeholders experienced cooperation that did not feel like capitulation. When the evaluation concluded, the Orun deliberative requested a debrief. Your intervention avoided escalation, they said. However, it relied heavily on subjective judgment and social negotiation. These elements are difficult to model and reproduce. Arkath nodded. Yes, that is one of our weaknesses. It is also one of our strengths. There is concern that your methods introduce unpredictability into systems that rely on precise forecasting, the deliberative continued. There is also concern that over-reliance on forecasting leads to paralysis when predictions conflict, Arkath replied. We are not suggesting that everyone adopt our approach. We are suggesting that there is value in having it available. The deliberative fell silent, processing. When it spoke again, its tone had shifted subtly. Your species exhibits a pattern of engaging with complex systems through iterative compromise rather than optimal solutions. This pattern reduces peak performance but increases survivability under unknown conditions. This is non-trivial. For Arkath, that assessment felt like a small victory, not because it granted humanity prestige, but because it acknowledged something humans had long understood about themselves, even if they rarely articulated it. They were not the best at anything in isolation. They were good at continuing when conditions refused to cooperate. In the aftermath, Tenacity of Clay was granted extended presence within the Nexus. Not full membership, not yet, but a status that allowed for further interaction and exchange. Human specialists were invited, cautiously, to observe other maintenance operations. In return, they shared their own hard-earned lessons about redundancy, repair under pressure, and the value of designing systems that assumed failure as a starting point rather than an anomaly. Arkath watched these exchanges with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She knew that admiration could turn to resentment if humanity's influence grew too quickly or was perceived as disruptive. She worked to temper expectations, emphasizing that humans were learners as much as contributors. One quiet cycle, as the ship drifted in relative calm, Selm joined her near the viewport. "Do you think they will ever fully trust us?" he asked. Arkath considered the question, gazing at the slow dance of constructs and stars. "Trust is not a switch," she said. "It is a habit. We are helping them form a new one. That takes time. And if they decide we are more trouble than we are worth, then we adapt," Arkath said. "We always have." As Tenacity of Clay continued its improbable journey through the Nexus, humanity's presence began to subtly alter the conversations around it. Not through dominance or charisma, but through a consistent demonstration that survival did not require perfection, and that cooperation did not require uniformity. In a region shaped by civilizations that had long sought balance through control, the arrival of a people shaped by chaos and persistence introduced a different equation, one that was still being solved. The measure of unyielding people, it seemed, was not how firmly they held to their own way, but how flexibly they could engage with others without losing themselves. And in that measure, humanity was proving to be unexpectedly formidable. With provisional status came new forms of pressure. Humanity was no longer an unknown variable to be observed from a distance, but a known anomaly whose presence demanded explanation, categorization, and, in some quarters, containment. The assemblies were not monolithic, and where some saw value in the human approach, others saw danger in its very unpredictability. Tenacity of Clay became a focal point not just for requests and evaluations, but for scrutiny that bordered on intrusion. The first sign that circumstances were shifting came when access corridors within the Nexus began to narrow. Pathways that had been opened during earlier operations now required additional authorization. Data streams arrived filtered, their resolutions subtly reduced. None of this was overtly hostile. It was administrative friction, the kind that civilizations used when they wished to slow something without provoking confrontation. Arkath noticed immediately. She had learned long ago that systems rarely failed all at once. They degraded, inch by inch, until movement became impossible. "They are testing our tolerance," she said during a briefing with her senior crew. "They want to see whether we push back, comply quietly, or overreach." "And what do we do?" Veshan asked. "We do what we always do," Arkath replied. "We document, we adapt, and we do not pretend this is accidental." The opportunity to respond came sooner than expected. A request arrived from a peripheral maintenance ring far from the central nexus, a region maintained primarily by a civilization whose perception of time operated on far longer scales than humanity's. Their message was terse and oddly phrased, translated as, "System drift exceeds acceptable bounds. Prior interventions insufficient. You are requested due to demonstrated engagement with failure. It was not an honorific invitation. It was closer to a concession. The maintenance ring in question surrounded a star whose output fluctuated unpredictably, bathing nearby pathways in erratic radiation and gravitational noise. Over millennia, layers of stabilization constructs had been added, each addressing a symptom rather than the underlying complexity. Now the ring itself was drifting out of alignment, its corrections lagging behind the star's behavior. Several assemblies had proposed large-scale restructuring, but disagreement over cost and risk had stalled action. As tenacity of clay approached the region, the scale of the problem became apparent. The maintenance ring was vast, its components stretching for distances that made human megastructures seem trivial by comparison. Portions glowed with active energy, while others flickered uncertainly, their outputs desynchronized. The star at the center pulsed and flared, indifferent to the fragile order imposed around it. "This is not something we can fix," Selm said quietly as data poured in. "Not in the sense they probably mean. No," Arkath agreed, "but we might be able to stop pretending it can be fixed at all." The local representatives were unlike any humanity had encountered so far. Their communications carried an undercurrent of resignation rather than frustration. "The star deviates," they said. "We correct. It deviates again. The ring responds too slowly. We have refined our models repeatedly. How much lag is there between deviation and correction?" Arkath asked. "On the order of several local cycles," came the reply. "Reducing lag further destabilizes other parameters." Arkath closed her eyes briefly, picturing the system not as equations, but as a living thing. "You are chasing the star," she said, "always reacting. What happens if you stop trying to match it exactly?" There was a pause, longer than translation alone would account for. "Imprecision accumulates," the representative said. "The ring drifts." "Yes," Arkath said, "but drift is not the same as collapse. You are spending enormous effort maintaining an alignment that the star does not respect." What if the ring were allowed to move more freely, within bounds, rather than constantly being pulled back? This was not a novel concept in abstract terms, but applying it to a structure of this scale challenged deeply held assumptions. The ring existed to impose order. Allowing it to drift felt like surrender. The humans proposed a radical shift in strategy. Instead of tightening corrections, they suggested loosening them, allowing sections of the ring to enter controlled oscillations synchronized not to the star's instantaneous output, but to its longer-term patterns. It was, in essence, an admission that perfect control was impossible and unnecessary. "Your proposal reduces precision," one representative noted. "It reduces stress," Selm countered. "Precision that cannot be maintained is not precision. It is a source of failure." The debate was intense, but unlike previous conflicts, there was less posturing. The local civilization had reached the limits of its approach and knew it. Reluctantly, a limited trial was authorized, confined to a peripheral segment of the ring whose failure would be survivable. Human engineers worked alongside local constructs, translating between design philosophies as much as technical specifications. The adjustments were subtle at first, introducing damping factors and adaptive thresholds that allowed the ring segment to absorb fluctuations rather than fight them. When the star flared, the segment flexed. When output dipped, it settled, not snapping back to a predefined position but finding a new equilibrium. The effect was not immediate stabilization, but a smoothing of extremes. Over multiple cycles, the segment's alignment drifted within acceptable bounds, its internal stresses decreasing measurably. Maintenance demands dropped. The system was not quieter, but it was healthier. Word of the trial spread quickly through the nexus. To some, it was a revelation. To others, it was heresy. A counter-argument emerged from an influential assembly that had long advocated for maximal control as the foundation of civilization-scale engineering. Their message to the Orun deliberative was blunt. The humans encourage degradation under the guise of resilience. Their methods undermine the principles that sustain the nexus. This time, the response was not immediate dismissal or endorsement. Instead, the deliberative requested testimony directly from Arcath. "You are accused of promoting acceptance of decay," the collective stated. "How do you respond?" Arcath did not hesitate. "We do not accept decay," she said. "We accept change. There is a difference. Decay is unmanaged change that leads to loss of function. What we propose is managed change that preserves function by relinquishing unnecessary constraints. Constraints define structure," the deliberative replied, "and too many constraints define fragility," Arcath said. "We learn that the hard way, systems break where they cannot bend." The exchange was transmitted widely, and reactions were polarized. Some assemblies began revisiting long-standing maintenance doctrines, experimenting cautiously with adaptive tolerances. Others doubled down on existing models, viewing the human influence as destabilizing. The nexus did not fracture over this disagreement, but fault lines became visible. Within tenacity of clay, the strain of constant engagement began to take its toll. Crew members showed signs of fatigue that no rotation schedule could fully alleviate. They were operating not just as engineers and analysts, but as cultural intermediaries, a role for which no training truly prepared them. Arcath felt the weight of every misinterpreted phrase, every decision that might echo far beyond its immediate context. One cycle, as she reviewed reports late into what her body still thought of as night, she received an unexpected message from Kethryn. "You are changing patterns," the being said without preamble. "We are responding to them," Arcath replied. "Change is a side effect. There is concern that your presence accelerates divergence among the assemblies," Kethryn said. "Some fear fragmentation." "Difference is not fragmentation," Arcath said. "It can be, if handled poorly, but suppressing difference has its own costs." Kethryn's eyes reflected a complex interplay of light. "Your species is accustomed to internal division," it observed. Arcath allowed herself a small, tired smile. "More than we would like, but we are also accustomed to finding ways to coexist despite it, sometimes messily. This messiness is difficult to integrate into long-term predictive frameworks," Kethryn said. "Then perhaps the frameworks need adjustment," Arcath replied gently. There was a long silence. When Kethryn spoke again, its tone carried something like uncertainty. "There are voices that propose limiting your access to critical systems to prevent further doctrinal influence. And there are voices that invited us in the first place," Arcath said. "We did not force ourselves into the nexus. We came because there was need." "Need can be temporary," Kethryn said. "So can caution," Arcath replied. "We are not asking to lead. We are asking to participate." The conversation ended without resolution, but Arcath sensed that something had shifted. The debate was no longer about whether humanity could contribute, but about whether it should be allowed to continue doing so. The tension came to a head when a failure occurred in a distant sector, one unrelated to any human intervention. A rigidly controlled pathway experienced an unforeseen resonance and collapsed, severing transit between multiple regions. The damage was extensive and the recovery effort costly. In the aftermath, voices rose, some blaming the incident on systemic overconfidence, others on the dilution of established practices. Humanity was drawn into the argument despite having no direct involvement. To some, the failure validated the need for more control. To others, it underscored the dangers of assuming control was absolute. Arcath was invited to address a broader assembly, one far larger and more diverse than any she had faced before. The scale of the audience was daunting, perceptions layered and overlapping in ways that made direct communication difficult. She took a moment to center herself before speaking. "We did not cause your failure," she said plainly. "We also cannot prevent all future failures. No one can. What we can offer is a different way of responding when failure happens, not with blame or denial, but with examination and adaptation. There is fear that your philosophy leads to complacency, came one response. There is fear that refusing to acknowledge limits leads to catastrophe, Arkath countered. Both fears are valid. The question is which one we choose to let guide us. She spoke not as a conqueror or a savior, but as someone intimately familiar with loss. She spoke of colonies that had failed because leaders insisted on maintaining appearances rather than addressing underlying problems. She spoke of successes born from admitting ignorance and trying something imperfect. She did not dress these stories in grand rhetoric. She let them stand as they were. When she finished, there was no immediate response. The silence that followed was not absence, but processing on a scale that made human pauses seem trivial. Arkath waited, hands resting on the cool surface of the podium construct, feeling the hum of energies beneath her feet. At last, the Aurun deliberative spoke. "Your presence has introduced variability into the nexus," they said. "This variability increases short-term uncertainty and long-term adaptability. The balance between these outcomes cannot be precisely calculated. Neither can the balance between safety and stagnation," Arkath said, "yet you have navigated it for a very long time." There was no formal verdict that day. Instead, what emerged was something more ambiguous and, in its own way, more significant. Humanity was neither fully embraced nor rejected. Its role remained conditional, contested, and evolving. As tenacity of clay returned to its anchorage, Arkath felt both relief and apprehension. The path ahead was anything but clear. Humanity had challenged assumptions not through force, but through example, and that challenge had consequences that would ripple outward for generations. Standing once more at the viewport, she watched the distant maintenance ring flex and settle around its unpredictable star. It was not perfect, it never would be, but it endured not by resisting change, but by moving with it. Arkath wondered if, in time, the Nexus itself might learn the same lesson, and whether humanity would still be there when it did. The moment of reckoning did not arrive as a dramatic confrontation or a sudden decree. It arrived the way most consequential shifts did in the Nexus, as a convergence of small pressures that together forced a decision. For humanity, that decision took the form of an invitation that was also a warning. The Aurun deliberative transmitted a proposal marked with an urgency designation higher than any previously assigned to human interactions. A region near the core of the Nexus, one that supported a disproportionate volume of transit and energy exchange, was exhibiting signs of systemic strain. Multiple subsystems were interacting in ways that existing models could no longer reliably predict. Several assemblies had competing remediation plans, each optimized for their own priorities, and the probability of deadlock was rising rapidly. "You are requested to participate in a joint intervention council," the deliberative stated. "Your role will be advisory, but your influence will not be restricted. Be advised, outcomes in this region will shape future governance structures within the Nexus." Arkath read the message in silence, feeling the weight of it settle into her bones. This was not another peripheral test or contained experiment. This was the heart of the system, both literally and politically. Participation meant visibility on a scale humanity had not yet faced. Refusal would signal caution, perhaps wisdom, but also an unwillingness to engage when stakes were highest. She convened her senior crew once more. The mood in the room was sober, stripped of the excitement that had accompanied earlier challenges. They all understood what this meant. "If we step into this," Selm said, "we are no longer just demonstrating a method. We are influencing outcomes that affect everyone here." "And if we do not," Veshan added, "we accept that others will decide how the Nexus evolves, and we live with the consequences of those decisions." Arkath listened, then spoke quietly. "We did not come this far to stand aside when things get difficult, but we also do not go in pretending we can fix everything. If we accept, we do so on our terms." Those terms were communicated clearly. Humanity would not serve as a tiebreaker imposed from above. They would not endorse any plan that ignored the risks to less influential participants. They would focus on process as much as outcome, emphasizing mechanisms that allowed ongoing adaptation rather than final solutions. The response from the deliberative was cautious but affirmative. Your conditions are acknowledged. Be aware that not all participants will accept your framing. Neither do all humans, Arkath replied. We will manage. The Joint Intervention Council convened within a construct so vast that tenacity of clay could have fit inside one of its internal voids without being noticed. Perception layers overlapped, some visual, some abstract, some emotional in ways that made Arkath's skin prickle. She was acutely aware that she represented not just herself or her crew, but an entire species still regarded as provisional. The region under discussion was presented in exhaustive detail. Energy flows, transit demands, maintenance histories, socio-political dependencies. The problem was not a single failure point, but a network of interdependencies that had grown increasingly brittle as demands increased. Efficiency had been optimized again and again, margins trimmed until there was little room left for error. This configuration is unsustainable, one assembly representative declared. We must reallocate capacity aggressively. That reallocation would destabilize peripheral regions, another countered. The cost is unacceptable, and maintaining the status quo invites collapse, a third added. The arguments looped, familiar patterns repeating with slight variations. Arkath watched, not intervening at first. She had learned that timing mattered more than eloquence. When she did speak, it was to ask a question rather than make a statement. What assumptions are shared across all your proposals? She asked. The council hesitated, unused to being asked to examine common ground rather than differences. Eventually, fragments of agreement emerged. All assumed continued growth in transit demand. All assumed centralized coordination was necessary. All assumed that failures must be prevented rather than accommodated. Arkath nodded. Those assumptions are not unreasonable, she said, but they are choices, not laws. Have any of you modeled scenarios where growth slows or where localized failure is allowed to occur without cascading? Localized failure is inefficient, came a response. So is total collapse, Arkath said. We are not suggesting embracing failure indiscriminately. We are suggesting designing systems that fail in ways that do not destroy everything else. She drew on human history again, not as anecdote, but as data. Power grids segmented to prevent blackouts from spreading. Fire breaks cut not to stop fire entirely, but to give it nowhere catastrophic to go. Economic systems that survived shocks because they were not optimized to the point of fragility. Some representatives dismissed these analogies as primitive. Others listened with growing interest. The concept of deliberately allowing minor failures to preserve the whole was not entirely foreign, but it had rarely been applied at this scale within the nexus. Over successive cycles, humanity's role shifted subtly. They became translators not just of language, but of intent. They reframed proposals in terms others could engage with, highlighted unintended consequences without accusation, and consistently brought discussions back to resilience rather than dominance. Not everyone appreciated this. A particularly influential assembly, whose power rested on providing high-efficiency transit services, pushed back hard. Your approach threatens our foundational role, their representatives stated bluntly. Decentralization reduces our relevance. Arkath met the statement head-on. It reduces your control, she said, not your value. Systems that are resilient still need expertise. They just do not depend on any single point of failure. That is an ideological position, the representative said. So is insisting that relevance must be preserved through centralization. Arkath replied calmly. We are not neutral, neither are you. The difference is that we are explicit about it. The tension escalated, and for a moment it seemed the council might fracture entirely. It was Catherine, unexpectedly, who intervened. The human delegate identifies a risk we have historically underestimated, Catherine said. Our longevity has been reinforced by stability, but that same stability has calcified certain structures. The Nexus has survived external threats. Its greater danger may be internal brittleness. The statement carried weight. Catherine was respected, and its willingness to publicly align, even partially, with the human perspective shifted the dynamics of the room. A compromise began to take shape, not a single grand redesign, but a phased approach. Core systems would be restructured to include intentional segmentation. Redundancies would be diversified rather than centralized. Growth projections would be revised to include scenarios of plateau and contraction, uncomfortable though those were for some. Humanity did not design these changes alone. They insisted on collaborative teams, pairing human specialists with representatives from multiple assemblies. The process was slow, frustrating, and riddled with disagreement, but it moved. The first phase was implemented cautiously. Almost immediately, minor failures occurred, just as predicted: small transit delays, localized instabilities. The difference was that these failures were contained, their impacts limited and instructive rather than catastrophic. Data flowed, adjustments were made, and confidence, fragile at first, began to build. Not everyone was convinced. Detractors pointed to every disruption as evidence of folly. Supporters countered with projections showing reduced risk of systemic collapse. The debate was fierce, but it was no longer paralyzing. For Arcath, the most telling moment came when a peripheral region experienced a significant failure that, under the old configuration, would have cascaded disastrously. Instead, the new segmentation absorbed the shock. Repairs were undertaken, traffic rerouted, the Nexus endured. The aftermath was not triumph, but reflection. The assemblies did not declare humanity saviors. They did something more meaningful. They adjusted their internal models to account for human-style resilience. It was a small change in terms of code and policy, but a profound one in philosophy. Humanity's status was quietly elevated, not announced with ceremony, but encoded into access permissions, consultation protocols, and long-term planning documents. Tenacity of Clay was no longer treated as a temporary guest. It was treated as a participant whose presence, while still controversial, was now woven into the fabric of the Nexus. With that shift came new responsibilities. Requests increased, expectations rose. Arcath found herself declining more often, setting boundaries to prevent overextension. "We are not infinite," she reminded the deliberative more than once. "Our strength lies in knowing when to stop pushing." "You speak as if limitation is a virtue," one collective observed. "It can be," Arcath said, "especially when the alternative is breaking." As the cycles passed, humanity's influence continued to spread, not as doctrine but as example. Other civilizations began to experiment cautiously with adaptive tolerances and failure-aware design. Some abandoned the experiments quickly. Others persisted, refining them into forms that suited their own contexts. Within Tenacity of Clay, the crew felt the change as well. They were no longer just surviving or proving themselves. They were shaping something larger, and that realization brought its own kind of gravity. Fatigue remained, but it was tempered by a sense of purpose that went beyond immediate crisis. One quiet interval, Selm joined Arcath again at the viewport. The Nexus core glowed in the distance, its pathways pulsing with activity. "Do you think we have changed them?" he asked. Arcath considered the question carefully. "I think we have reminded them that change is always happening," she said. "They can either acknowledge it or be surprised by it." "And us?" Selm asked. "Have they changed us?" Arcath smiled faintly. "They have given us a larger mirror. We see our own flaws more clearly now, our impatience. Our tendency to improvise when planning would help, but also our capacity to adapt without losing ourselves." She rested her hand against the viewport, feeling the faint vibration of the ship's systems. Tenacity of Clay had been built to endure, not to dominate. In the vast, ancient machinery of the Nexus, that quality had proven unexpectedly valuable. The measure of unyielding people, Arcath reflected, was not how loudly they announced their strength, but how consistently they applied it in service of something larger than themselves. Humanity was still learning that measure, even as it taught it to others. The final chapter of this chapter, she knew, had not yet been written. The change that followed was not marked by proclamation, but by accumulation. Humanity's presence in the Nexus ceased to be a novelty and became, instead, a factor that had to be accounted for. Systems updated their parameters. Councils adjusted their quorum thresholds to include a human voice. Maintenance doctrines began to carry annotations referencing adaptive tolerance ranges derived, in part, from human-led trials. None of this was uniform or uncontested, but it was real, and it was irreversible. For Arkath Moran, that realization brought neither elation nor fear, but a sober sense of responsibility that settled into her daily routines. She had not sought to steer the future of interstellar infrastructure or philosophy. She had sought a place where humanity could exist without being crushed by forces too large to argue with. Now, existence itself carried weight. The first real test of that weight came when a conflict arose not from systems or physics, but from people. A mid-scale civilization, one that had long existed at the periphery of the Nexus, formally petitioned for expanded autonomy over a cluster of pathways that passed through its region of space. Their claim was grounded in centuries of maintenance labor and cultural attachment. Opposing them was a powerful transit consortium whose efficiency metrics depended on standardized control over those same pathways. The dispute was not new, but the petition was, and it arrived at a moment when doctrines of resilience and decentralization were gaining traction. The assemblies were divided. Some saw the petition as a logical extension of recent reforms. Others saw it as a dangerous precedent that could unravel hard-won coherence. The Orun deliberative flagged the situation as volatile and once again requested human participation. Arkath hesitated longer this time. "This is not a system problem," she told her crew during the briefing. "This is a governance problem. Whatever we say will be interpreted as endorsement or obstruction." "We cannot avoid that forever," Veshen replied. "Our influence exists whether we use it or not." Selm leaned back, arms crossed. "If we stay silent now, others will decide what our principles mean. That might be worse than being wrong." Arkath knew they were right. Influence unused did not remain neutral. It was claimed by those more willing to wield it. The council convened with an undercurrent of tension that no translation layer could fully smooth. Representatives spoke in carefully constructed arguments, citing precedent, stability, efficiency, identity. The petitioning civilization emphasized stewardship and lived experience. The consortium emphasized throughput and collective benefit. Both framed their positions as essential to the health of the Nexus. When Arkath was invited to speak, she did not immediately address the petition itself. "Humanity is new here," she began. "We do not have millennia of precedent to lean on. What we have is a history of navigating power imbalances that, if mishandled, tear societies apart." Some representatives bristled at the implication. She continued anyway. "In our experience, systems fail not when authority is shared, but when it is denied legitimacy. People comply with structures they feel part of. They resist structures imposed without regard for their stake." The consortium's representative responded sharply. "You equate sentiment with governance. The Nexus is sustained by function, not feeling." "Function depends on participation," Arkath replied. "Maintenance is not just labor, it is commitment. You cannot extract that indefinitely without consequence." She turned then to the petitioning civilization. "Autonomy is not isolation," she said. "If granted, it carries obligations as well as rights. Are you prepared to maintain interoperability, to share data transparently, to accept oversight when your decisions affect others?" The reply came without hesitation. Yes. The simplicity of the answer shifted something in the room. It was not a guarantee of good faith, but it was a clear statement of intent. Arkath addressed the council again. This is not a question of choosing sides. It is a question of designing a structure that can absorb difference without breaking. You can deny this petition and preserve uniformity in the short term, or you can grant conditional autonomy and invest in mechanisms that manage diversity over time. Conditional autonomy introduces complexity, one assembly objected. So does suppressing it, Arkath said. The difference is whether that complexity is visible and manageable or hidden until it explodes. The debate stretched across cycles. Humanity did not dominate it. They did not deliver a final verdict, but they reframed the terms again and again until the question was no longer whether autonomy was dangerous, but how to make it survivable. In the end, a compromise emerged. The petition was granted in stages, with clearly defined responsibilities, shared monitoring, and predefined review points. It was not the full independence the petitioners had sought, nor the complete control the consortium preferred. It was, in human terms, a workable mess. The aftermath was tense but stable. The pathways continued to function. Maintenance improved in some areas, dipped in others, then recovered. Disputes arose and were resolved through the new mechanisms rather than through deadlock. The nexus did not fracture, it adjusted. For many assemblies, that adjustment was the final proof they needed. Humanity's approach did not just apply to broken machines. It applied to living systems, to societies and relationships that could not be optimized without being diminished. The Orun Deliberative issued an update to humanity's status, encoded quietly into the Nexus frameworks. Humanity was no longer classified as a provisional participant. It was designated as an adaptive contributor, a category previously reserved for collectives whose methods resisted full formalization but demonstrated long-term value. Arkath received the notice alone, late in what her body insisted was night. She read it once, then again, feeling neither triumph nor relief, but something closer to completion. Later she gathered the crew in the communal space where so many decisions had been argued into existence. There were no speeches prepared. "We have crossed a line," she said simply, "not into control and not into safety, into responsibility." No one cheered, a few nodded, one or two looked daunted. That was as it should be. "What happens now?" Halloran asked, no longer hesitant, but still young enough to ask the question honestly. Arkath smiled. "Now we keep doing what we have been doing. We help where asked. We say no when needed. We learn, we make mistakes. We fix what we can. And when we cannot, we try to fail in ways that do not destroy everything else." "And Earth?" someone asked. "The rest of humanity, they will come," Arkath said, slowly, carefully, "and they will bring their own arguments and contradictions with them. That is not a threat. That is who we are." In the cycles that followed, tenacity of clay became less singular. Other human vessels arrived, built with the same philosophy of repairability and redundancy, carrying specialists eager and anxious to find their place. They were not given free access. They were tested, as the first had been. Some failed those tests. Others passed in unexpected ways. Humanity did not become dominant in the Nexus. It became present. For the assemblies, this presence was a constant reminder that survival did not require transcendence. It required engagement. It required the humility to accept limits and the stubbornness to push against them anyway. For Arkath, the greatest change was internal. She no longer felt like she was standing at the edge of an abyss, arguing for the right not to fall. She felt like she was standing within a structure vast enough to hold disagreement without shattering, one to which humanity now contributed a particular kind of strength. On her final watch before transferring command to a successor, Arkath stood at the viewport one last time. The Nexus stretched before her, not as a perfect machine, but as a living system, scarred, adaptive, and enduring. Tenacity of clay hummed beneath her feet, its patched hull and overworked systems a quiet testament to everything humanity had brought with it across the lattice. Not superiority, not destiny, just the refusal to stop, even when stopping would have been easier. The measure of unyielding people, Arkath thought, was not found in conquest or acclaim. It was found in the willingness to remain present, to shoulder responsibility without certainty, and to build futures that could survive their own imperfections. And in that measure, humanity had finally found its place among the stars.